Hey, Clayton, why was the death penalty used for so many things in Leviticus? Good question. First thing to keep in mind is that the penalties offered in Leviticus were maximum penalties, not minimum or required penalties. Okay. The reason we know this is because we have examples of them actually doling out the penalty. There was a case at the end of Leviticus where there is someone who has committed a crime where they could be executed. And instead of simply executing the person, they go to the Lord and inquire, what should we do with this particular situation? And so if it was straightforward, if it was just every time this happens, you should execute the person, they would have just carried it out and obeyed the rule. But if they knew there's actually some leeway, each situation is unique, we need some judgment calls made, they could go to the Lord and say, what do you think about this particular situation? Because maybe they wouldn't have executed the person, okay? So it wasn't always required, but it was actually still an option, okay? And so this is the part that we've got to grapple with. They did execute people, even though they didn't execute people all the time, and it makes us uncomfortable, okay? Not because every one of us says never should someone be executed, but because the things they executed people for were more severe than what any of us would consider. Executing someone for breaking the Sabbath, or for striking a parent, or disrespecting a parent, or for adultery, these sorts of things. You say, these are not the sort of things that we're going to be comfortable with in our society having the death penalty for. So how do we think about these things, okay? Few factors that help us try to get our heads around this. The first is this. We tend to underestimate the seriousness of sin. Okay, this is just the human condition. We do not see how offensive our sin is to God, how disrespectful it is. We don't see how it undermines society and poisons the culture around us. We don't see how it degrades us. We don't see how it harms other people and ruins our relationships. We do not see the pervasive way our sin, especially our serious sin, impacts the world around us and is offensive to God. And so we think, what's the big deal? But God doesn't see it that way. Second thing to think about is Israel in particular is a covenant community, which means that they were responsible as a community for keeping the agreement they had with God. And that included saying, we are not going to tolerate certain things, okay? And so it wasn't just a matter of like, well, there's this one guy, and if he's going to live that way, okay, whatever, God will deal with him. It was a matter of saying, we as a community are going to be responsible. We're going to be liable if we say, we know that's going on, but we didn't do anything about it. And so there's a need to actually have some definitive break and say, no, this will not be okay in our society. The death penalty also was an act of deterrence, okay? You can debate all you want, whether or not that would be effective, but it certainly was a factor in people's behavior. Also, the death penalty has echoes of Eden and the fall. So when you think about it, the introduction of sin, what does God say happens if you disobey him? You will surely die. And when Adam and Eve sin, what happens? They are excluded from the source of life. They're excluded from the tree of life, which means they will eventually die. And so to say within the covenant community, there are certain things that are like eating the fruit, which means you've got to be cut off from life. You've got to be cut off from the community here. There are also historical and cultural differences that are worth factoring in. Many ancient societies had very harsh penalties, but Israel's laws were actually more restrictive compared to other ancient law codes. They had ways to atone for things. They had ways to pay fines. They had cities of refuge. This is the interesting thing. If someone killed someone, there was actually cities designated in their country where the person who had killed the person could go and flee, where they could be safe from having vengeance taken on them. And so there are all sorts of things built into the Israelite system that actually were mitigating against harsh punishments rather than facilitating harsh punishments. But the question with all of this is like, okay, if I can get my head around why they did it that way, then what modern implications does it have? Okay, the first thing to know is that the civic laws in the Old Testament don't transfer to modern society is one for one, okay? No one is going to look at the Bible and say, we should execute adulterers or people who break the Sabbath or these sorts of things. God is not expecting that of us. This was not something that he was saying, this is the rules that should be for all societies everywhere for all time, okay? These were rules that were given to Israel about how they were to be governed under God's authority with God as their king. And that is not true of Canada and France and the United States and Indonesia and everywhere else, okay? It is not saying you've got to use all the same laws that Israel did. So the civic laws don't transfer it like that. Even though it does actually communicate things God values, it isn't something that you can just say, well, they did it that way, we're going to do it that way. What's interesting is when you're reading the New Testament, all of the places where the death penalty would be invoked, you know what happens? Is excommunication. Okay, because God's people are the church, right? And so you say, within the church community, how do we enforce the standards of God? So if someone commits adultery, if someone commits one of these serious crimes, and they're unrepentant, they're not turning away from that, they're doing it in a way that says whatever, what happens? Well, they are excluded from the covenant community. They're excluded from the church. They're put on the outside. And those are things that in the Old Testament would have resulted in death, but in the New Testament result in exclusion, excommunication from the church. And so we still deal with those things, but we don't deal with them using capital punishment. Of course, the further question is, what do we do in a modern society, right? Like there is this debate about the role of capital punishment in a society. And we're not just talking about what should have happened in Israel, but we're talking about in any other country, any other place, right? What should happen in a society? Is capital punishment okay? And there's this great debate about it, right? There are lots of people, thoughtful people on both sides of this wrestling with this question. From a biblical perspective, here are the questions we've got to answer. And I'll tell you on the start, these are complex questions. You might have an opinion about them. You might think you know what to think about them. But when you start to dig in, they get complicated. So here are the two questions. Is it permitted for the government to take life? You just got to ask the question, is it even an option on the table? Is that something a government is allowed to do? And you might think, I know the answer to that question, but the debate is more complex from a biblical Christian perspective than you might think. Second, if it's possible for a government to take life, if it's permitted, is the system that we have in place good at avoiding killing someone who is actually innocent, like accidentally, mistakenly killing someone who is innocent? This is something that God actually cares about a lot about. All throughout the Bible, God says, I don't want you to acquit the guilty or condemn the innocent. And it goes out of its way to say you've got to make sure you have safeguards when you are punishing someone, that you are not punishing someone who does not deserve it, and especially when the punishment is as severe and permanent as the death penalty. And so you've got to ask the question, okay, if it's permitted, do you have a system that allows you to do that without having people who shouldn't be executed? Because that is a serious, serious thing. So those are the questions we've got to wrestle with. Now, I'm not going to wade into those waters. Those are complicated, but those are the things that we've got to think about. Now, when we back up and we ask the question about the death penalty, here's the thing we've always got to keep in mind. Our rebellion, your rebellion and my rebellion, will lead to the death penalty. It will lead to eternal death. That is what our sin deserves. Each and every one of us. There's not one of us that is not deserving of capital punishment in the ultimate eternal sense. And you've got to take that really, really seriously. One day, God will execute final capital punishment for all sinners who do not repent. The good news, though, is that Jesus took our death penalty. Jesus stepped into death row and he said, I will take it for you. And so whatever we think about death penalty in a modern society, whatever we think about death penalty in ancient Israel, what we have to remember is this is not an abstract thing out there. This is something that applies to you and me in a cosmic, eternal sense, and Jesus himself has provided a way out.
Thanks for listening. If you've got your own questions, email questions@BibleSavvy.com. Like and subscribe to catch our regular episodes every Monday on the Bible Savvy Podcast.